Right, morning everyone. So my name is Frank Starling, founder and CEO of Variety Pack. We're diversity, equity and inclusion consultants. Very pleased to be here today to talk about inclusive talent strategy, inclusive recruitment. Really just want to throw some things at you which hopefully are going to be practical. So we're going to focus on that end. So I'm going to talk for about 20, probably 25 minutes, then open up for any questions. But I'm going to be monitoring the chat window as well if you have any questions as we go through this process. And I recognize that we might all be in kind of different places. Some may have just started out in our businesses. Some might be a little bit further along. So I'm going to try and make, the conversation today as relevant to all of you as possible. All right. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen there. There we go. All right. And our topic is a difficult one to master. And I say that because not every organization is intentional about being inclusive with their talent strategy, with recruitment. We can't go into every single detail today, but today I just want to throw some scenarios at you, some points of reflection as well. So I think that's going to be a really important reference point for you going forward. A bit about my background. So I started my D&I journey just over 7 years ago. I was working with my local community of Hackney. I grew up in Hackney in East London to tackle unemployment with young black men. It was the highest in the country at the time. I was working in property and it really inspired me to actually pivot towards diversity and inclusion. And a lot of it was based on my lived experience as well. I worked on an accelerator program called the Brixton Finishing School that gets underrepresented talent into the creative industry. I was a VP of a tech company where we delivered D&I programs, and I founded Variety Pack just over 4 years ago. I have a couple of other hats. I'm also an enterprise advisor for Mayor of London, and that's where I work with schools and colleges on their career strategy. I'm also a fellow of the RSA, and I've got accreditation from many different places in diversity, equity and inclusion. Our organization, Variety Pack, so we work with companies large and small, from companies that are just emerging out all the way to kind of larger enterprise organizations. And our focus is how do we create a more inclusive culture that is equitable for everyone. Equity really meaning fairness, and I'm going to dive into that in a bit of detail today. So quick agenda, I'm just going to set the scene with you in terms of just talking about why this is important. Got kind of an opening activity, which is somewhat, I'm going to try and make it a bit interactive there, slightly interactive if possible, and then a few situations for us to just go through and think about, and some closing actions. Without further ado, get straight into it, right? So let's set the scene. People face biases due to their race, sexuality, religion, other aspects of their identity. Being inclusive within the hiring process requires effort and commitment. We can all be unconsciously biased, and knowing that bias exists isn't enough. We must commit to action. Why are all of these things are important? Well, we know that on a societal level, there are systemic barriers, right? Things like sexism, racism, Islamophobia, transphobia, the list goes on. And what we often think is that these things are confined to the worst, most hideous events in society, but they're not. They're on a spectrum, and they happen in the workplace as well. So when we grow organizations, we have to acknowledge the existence of these systemic barriers in the workplace. So being inclusive with our hiring practice means we're taking a step back and we're considering the barriers that people might have to face in order to join an organization, even to just get access to opportunities. We also need to admit to ourselves that we are all unconsciously biased. We're afraid to admit it. There are over 180 cognitive biases that we're up against in our brains. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how nice we are as people, we all hold a bias of some sorts, and that requires us to have a sense of humility in terms of how we approach this. And then the last point, knowing that bias exists isn't enough. We have to commit to action. How common is bias? It's incredibly common. It's incredibly common. I'm going to refer you to this resource that you can log on to, implicit.harvard.edu. This was created by the Harvard Institute in the late 90s. Over 20 million people, even more than that now, over 20 million people have taken bias tests online by this resource, and it's kind of like a hub for you to just test your biases, and it feeds into this huge anonymous data set. And what it tells us is that depending on the regions, there are lots of different unconscious biases that emerge from different people from different backgrounds. And I guess what we're trying to accept is that during the process of us starting or growing a company, it's very usual for people to build in their biases into both their company culture all the way through to their, their talent strategy in general. So we've got to just take a step back and really consider how this plays out. Here are some examples. Affinity bias is probably one of the most common. And that's where we tend to like people that we share a lived experience with. So we can end up hiring teams that pretty much just look like us. They replicate us in some particular way. It could be based on your race, your gender, or something else. Stereotypes. We often uphold stereotypes. Oh, I wouldn't hire that person because they don't work hard enough. Or I wouldn't hire someone from that territory because of X. We've got to be careful. When we kind of use stereotypes, even just in jokes sometimes, we reinforce our biases and we reinforce what stereotypes represent. That example, Uncle Ben, so this person was approached in the 1940s to be the face of Uncle Ben's, which is I'm sure you've seen it, a brand that sells things like, rice and beans and all sorts, the stuff that you fill up your pantry with. And why that's a stereotype is it upholds that Black people are meant to be the help, during that time, right? They're cleaning the kitchens, helping in the kitchen, etc., and so on, cleaning the floors, never the business owners, etc. So it upholds that kind of racist stereotype. So they have now changed their name to Ben's Original. Confirmation bias, you've got to look out for that. And that's where you're unwilling to see the full picture. You're just seeing what you want to see. So if I had a resume and I can see this person's got a particular educational background, they'll fit in, they'll figure it out. I'm then willing to ignore the fact that I've not actually challenged them on their values. How does their values align with my values or the values of the organization? And it doesn't even, I've met many founders, I work with many different companies, and it doesn't even matter if someone is trying to advocate for underrepresented. You can still build in your biases into that process. All right, so I want to take us into our icebreaker activity. I've got 5 questions that I'm going to put up on the screen. I just want you to reflect on these questions, and I'll say a couple of things on each one. So we'll start with a hypothetical scenario. Imagine you're a hiring manager, you've got headcount in your team, and you're tasked with hiring, let's say, an account director for your company, or whatever position that might be, a senior position in your organization. So I've got 5 questions for you to think about that the candidate may ask you. So how would you answer these questions? You can even tell me some of your answers in the chat window if you wish. Right, so question 1, when writing your job advert, have you checked for language and phrases which are known to deter people from underrepresented groups? So just think for a second, how would you answer that question? And I guess why this is important is, I mentioned that point of stereotypes. We can build in stereotypical language into job adverts all the time. And that could be anything from gendered language, when words that appeal to men and they would more appeal to women, cisgendered women, let's say, people that aren't necessarily given that safe space to have I guess, be themselves as well. I guess my point there, sorry, with job descriptions, without going off on a tangent, is it's easy to just copy and paste job descriptions without thinking about how inclusive the language is. So a good example is, let's take disabilities. 15% of the world identifies as having a disability. Often in job adverts, there is no, if you're working in an office environment, there's no description of the office itself. So it doesn't say whether it would be accessible to someone who, let's say, has a physical disability. If you're neurodiverse, that puts you in maybe multiple categories. You may be challenged with dyslexia, let's say. You may be on the spectrum, so autism, ADHD. You may also have a long-term clinical mental health challenge like OCD. It's beneficial then to describe the environment for people who might be neurodiverse. Is it particularly loud or quiet? Is it very spacious or very cramped? All of that is going to determine the kind of experience of this person and really help them to decide whether joining your company is a good idea. Of course, in a remote first world, I guess we can talk about other things, the intensity of the day. If we start at 9 and finish at 6, is that the first hour and the last hour you have to yourselves, or is the expectation that the minute we clock on at 9, you've got to be always on? All of these things, I think, really help to open up how inclusive a job ad might be. Question 2, would you have a diverse panel of interviewers or reviewers? So, often people don't necessarily show their best selves. I remember going for an interview in a large tech company. This is years ago. And I was walking through the building. There were 5 floors in the building. And I didn't see one person I identify with. I identify as Black and I'm mixed race. I'm half Asian and half West African. I grew up in London. But I guess I was just looking for maybe just one Black person in the building. I didn't see anyone. And then when I went into the interview, equally, there was no one diverse in that interview as well. What made it worse is there was no conversation around diversity inclusion at all. So in the absence of a diverse panel, it's not always possible that you can have 2 people that interviews, especially if you're starting out. You might be the only person conducting that interview. At least in that interview, talk about diversity inclusion, why it's important to your organization, why you want to support people that are underrepresented, but more so, you want people to bring their best selves into that interview and into obviously your organization in general. Okay, number 3, have you advertised the role in a range of places known to be used by different groups when looking for a job? And this is important from a couple of different fronts. Firstly, we're more likely to use channels that we are just very familiar with, or channels that are very well advertised. So LinkedIn, for example, Indeed, I think they're perfectly good resources to get your job ads out there. I would say also think about how you can connect to communities. Like, this is a community here, right? This is a great community to hopefully funnel the message that you're looking for, particular roles. There are other communities out there that you can tap into that represent many different underrepresented groups, and it's good to build up that narrative with them, because that's how you're going to be more exposed to obviously different groups of people, especially those who don't always get that access. Question 4, do you have a process in place for challenging bias and subjectivity? You'd be surprised how much we build in gut feeling into the process of hiring. I'm going to share with you a quote which is from a professor at Cornell University in New York, one of the places I studied diversity and inclusion. And the quote is, "You are responsible for your second thought and your first action." Your first thought, that's the one full of stereotypes and full of bias. We can compare it to our gut feeling. Your second thought is where you have an opportunity to slow your thinking down. So your first thought is where hopefully you can make that decision to be unbiased versus biased. So a good example is, I meet someone for the first time on Zoom. I'm interviewing a candidate. My first thought, I haven't even spoken to them, but my first thought is, I'm not sure about this person. There's something about them which I just don't particularly like. My second thought is, why do I think that way? What's led me to that decision? What is it I don't like about them? So my first action, if I'm to be unbiased, is actually I'm going to speak with them. I'm going to give them that chance to explain to me who they are, and let's discuss our shared values. And then I'll make a judgment, and then I'll make a decision in my mind, as opposed to building in my bias. The second thing that we can do is really have a framework. So have a list of questions that you can use to ensure that you're not just kind of making things up. You're not just asking questions that you think may favor the candidate. You're being fair throughout that process. And this, I'd apply exactly the same principles for when you're trying to promote in your organization as well. It's easy to just kind of latch onto your favorites in the company, but favoritism in itself obviously holds a bias. All right, last one is, do you make a focused effort to increase diversity? I spoke at the start about those systemic barriers. Many of us leverage our privilege to turn away from those barriers. We don't have to wake up every morning for many of us, we don't have to wake up and really think, actually, I want to try to tackle some of the barriers that exist on a societal level and ensure that, those things don't exist in the workplace. So that's a privilege in itself. So we've got to really just consider, how do we ensure that we're not trying to hire people because of tokenism or because it's a performative measure. We genuinely care about creating a level playing field. And of course, you might be underrepresented yourself. And that then, that means that you also need allies, right, in your own journey. And that's perfectly fine. So it's kind of just considering, what is my privilege to turn away? How can I increase access for people who are underrepresented? It's only going to benefit you in the long run, whether it's products or services, whatever your offering is as an organization. You're hiring people that better reflect society as opposed to what might be your own biases. So a couple of takeaways, I guess, is really think about what are your strengths in this area? What could you improve on? Is it finding candidates? Is it how you're hiring right now, the kind of questions you're asking yourself? It could be something simple in terms of dialing into that second thought and that first action to be a bit more unbiased. All right, I want to move on now. So I want to talk about equity and allyship before a couple of scenarios. So equality versus equity. Equality, as we know, is where everyone gets access to the same thing. So if I brought everyone breakfast this morning and I said, great, I'm going to get you 2 boiled eggs on toast, some of you will think, fantastic, I love boiled eggs, that's amazing, it's a perfect breakfast. Some of you will think that sounds lousy, or I don't eat breakfast, but that's equality. Everyone gets access to the same thing, and most of our policies are geared towards equality. Equity is where we ask people what they want for breakfast, essentially. It's kind of trying to create a better sense of a level playing field. When people say the statements like, it's it's a true meritocracy, or we hire the best people, that completely ignores that not everyone has access to opportunities. Not everyone, it's not obvious that certain underrepresented groups will be able to come forward. So in that second window there, we've seen this image no doubt 1,000 times. In that second window, we're trying to level the playing field. We're trying to create balanced policies and procedures. So in a practical sense for your organization, it's looking at what is our hiring process. If we're a small company, if we're a growing company, let's be intentional from the start. And I've seen it time and time again. I've seen it work incredibly well when organizations think about diversity and inclusion from the very beginning. Then as they grow, they maintain that culture. For organizations that they have it as an afterthought, that's exactly what happens when they are 100 people, 200 people, 500 people. They essentially build teams which are homogeneous in some way, or just kind of lack inclusion in general. So you've got massive opportunity, I think, to get it right. Allyship is really at the center of it. So allyship is where we show up for each other. It's that process of building relationships. The challenge around allyship is 92% of us already see ourselves as allies in the workplace, and only 29% say they speak up when they perceive bias, and 34% simply ignore it. So being an ally is really trying to support those who are underrepresented, who are marginalized, minoritized by society. So you can be an ally by, in the first instance, speaking up. If you perceive bias in your team, create this safe space for it to be challenged. You're not calling people out, you're not canceling people, you're calling people in. It's like, okay, actually what you've just said, I think may hold a bias. Or what's led you to that decision for hiring that person over that person? Let's talk about it, let's discuss it. Creating that space to challenge each other, well, it ties directly into psychological safety. I'd recommend a book for you called The Fearless Organization. That was written by Amy Edmondson. She's done over 25 years of research on the importance of psychological safety in organizations. It doesn't account for every aspect of diversity and inclusion, but it does remind us that we have to create those safe spaces, especially when it comes to challenging bias in this entire process. All right, so I want to move on now to a couple of scenarios and solutions, some situations and solutions. Similar to before, I'm going to just, instead of discussing, just really want you to think about what would you do in the following situations? How would you respond? Would you challenge? Would you remain the same? I'm going to put a situation on screen, and then I'm going to go through what the solution might be. All right, so first situation is you're on a hiring committee and a colleague rules out a woman of color because she's not a good cultural fit. Underrepresented candidates can often be missed or ignored due to the belief that they won't fit in to current work culture. So what would you do in that scenario? I'll show you the solution in a second. All right, Emma said, don't forget to add questions to the chat. Yeah, please don't forget to add questions to the chat. I was reading that, I thought that was a solution there. I was just like, yeah. All right, so do ask questions to the chat as we go through. All right, what to do? I think it's important to ask for specifics. How has that person come to that decision? Are we thinking about culture add versus fit, challenge, bias, and subjectivity? And you've got to do this within yourself more often than not. You may make a decision which you don't think is biased because no one's challenged you. You've hired someone who you think is absolutely the right person for your company, and that's fine. That's a good thing. But we've got to be mindful of affinity bias. You know, we tend to favor people we share a lived experience or identity with. And if that's happening, you've got to ask questions as to why. What's the pattern? Why have the last 2 hires in my company, why do they share the same race as me or the same gender? Actually, let's really just think about that. Okay. Second situation, you're on a hiring committee and you notice that your colleagues prefer candidates who are men over women for certain roles. This is usually a clear signal that unconscious bias is present in the process, which can disadvantage women. Just going to read one point from the chat, which is record and report, but that's the salty chaos within. Yeah, I think you should record it. I think you should speak up as well, though, right? You should challenge. Solution to this is speak up and mention when you have noticed it. You're being an ally when you do. Research shows that when teams agree on set criteria, processes become more fair. Why is this important? Performance bias. Men are often rated higher than women, even when they hold similar qualifications. All right, this happens in lots of different ways. It's like the stereotype of, someone deciding to have kids, for example. 2% of roles, according to Lean In, 2% of roles globally, irrespective of gender, are negatively impacted when a person decides that actually I want to have kids. So that's like a really nasty stereotype that can obviously impact many people in the workplace. Okay, so out of these scenarios, I think it's just important to just consider what kind of scenarios are you going to be in based on your role. Would it be the fact that people are saying things around you which inherently may hold a bias, and it's often just left unchallenged? Can you be that ally? Can you choose to step up and really choose to speak up and be involved in that process? Or more importantly, what kind of framework are you using to hire people into an organization? I know if I'm in an interview and someone asks me, tell me about yourself, that for me as an underrepresented candidate, someone from a low socioeconomic background, that can be a very, very hard question for me to answer, because I'm not really sure which angle to go through. And I don't have, I didn't grow up getting all this kind of amazing interview experience. So all of these things we're trying to consider in terms of, even just how we approach these conversations. Sam said it's hard to speak up in situations like this without getting emotional. How to do it professionally is key, but hard. It is hard, especially when we're passionate about fairness. So I think instead of calling that person out, we're just trying to frame, actually, look, can I, you might even just say, can I challenge what has just been said? And is this a safe space, right? And it may not end up being a safe space, but you're just trying to frame the fact that I'm not trying to completely throttle you. I'm trying to explain that I would like to be an ally by challenging, the situation I've just seen. So ask questions. Sourcing and hiring underrepresented candidates requires a desire to see an industry that is truly diverse and inclusive. And this needs to be on you. This is a decision that you've got to make. Here are some reflections to think about. Why would an underrepresented candidate want to join your company? Is there any explanation of diversity inclusion on the website? Is there a clear understanding of what accessibility looks like, especially for those that may have a disability? Is it clear that that person is going to receive the support they need? Are all of these things obvious? How would you make it clear that this is something you believe in? When you talk about your values on a company website, when you're speaking to a candidate for an interview, make it clear that diversity inclusion is important. Or if you've just started the journey, be transparent on that. I think that's really important. And then what would you do to hold yourself accountable to change? make that note of privilege again. If we have the privilege of turning away from making biased decisions all the time, unless we actually choose to disrupt that privilege, we never truly will see a kind of a level playing field, that equity that I spoke about earlier. Right, so why is this important? Well, you kind of see those stats time and time again. Diverse and inclusive organizations outperform across all KPIs. It is actually true. There's lots of data out there. It's not necessarily for the reasons you think. Often we say, well, hiring diverse groups is better business. That's kind of like a generic one-liner. It makes a lot of sense, and it does typically happen in many organizations. But more importantly, we're creating a genuine level playing field. We're creating an environment where people feel more comfortable to be inclusive with each other, because you've got different groups of people who are merging together. You're then more likely to see a higher level of engagement, retention, a higher level of morale, right? So it isn't just down to this stat of, if I hire lots of people who are underrepresented in the company, we're going to do well. Well, if they come into an environment which is uninclusive, then no, you're probably not going to do well at all. So you've got to think about both sides. Diversity is important because I want to level the playing field. I want to represent the society that we serve. Inclusion is important because I want to create a space where everyone can thrive. So small wins. Think about these things. A clear diversity statement. Don't make it a generic one. Speak from your values. When I say a diversity statement, what diversity and inclusion means for your organization. Use inclusive language as well. Upskill yourself to challenge bias. If you know nothing about your biases right now, people often say, I don't know what I don't know. Okay, well, find out. Take the bias test online, learn about cultures and lived experiences you don't identify with. The list goes on. Connect to new communities. In terms of big wins, so ensure all roles have standardized criteria. Be clear in your job descriptions. These are the tasks that are critical for the role. These are the tasks that are desired. This is what you need in terms of experience. This is what our office space will look like, or this is basically how we work. We work remotely, etc., and so on. Have all of that very clear, and then across all of your roles, ensure that that is standardized, and the interview process is standardized as well. Use a checklist to challenge bias by asking questions based on skills, based on values, not based on feelings and gut feelings or anything else emotive. Monitor voluntary demographics if you can. Obviously, get that demographic data, see who's coming in the door and who's not necessarily getting to shortlist stage, for example. And then finally, build new partnerships and tools. I think that's crucially important in this process as well. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I want to say thank you. If you have any questions, you can email me. We'll get through your response. Hey there at varietypack.co. I want to now go to your questions as well, but I just end the presentation there, and thanks for listening.
That was so wonderful. I wrote down, there were 3 things that you said that totally I hadn't heard before. I love the expression calling people in versus calling people out. I think that is such a wonderful framework to create space for these discussions. I love the second thought, first action. So well said. And the culture add versus culture fit. My first question, and then remember, anyone, if you want to ask a question live, please pop your hand up. How do you think about measuring diversity? Because obviously there's so many different categories like socioeconomic, race, sexuality, neurodiversity. How do you measure that across your company? But then also, if you are let's say entering a new workspace and you're trying to get a gauge on the team's commitment to diversity, but of course it's not always apparent just from looking around. How do you factor that in to that?
Yeah, so I think the first question, I think in terms of measuring diversity, it can depend on the territory you're in. So for example, in France, you couldn't ask questions around race, and there's certain questions, demographics that you just couldn't take at all. I think if you're a UK-based company, potentially you could ask people to share, not declare, so as opposed to, okay, we're going to attribute you as a person to these demographics, you might just send out an anonymous survey where you're trying to understand who's in the organization. You know, we might be more diverse than we think, maybe beyond like visual aspects of diversity like race. So I think creating a survey which can be sent out once a year or twice a year, whatever, to really kind of gauge your demographics from that perspective, I think is beneficial. In terms of which categories, yeah, I think that really depends on what are we trying to measure. You know, certainly we're trying to abide to the Equality Act in the UK at least, and identify those with protected characteristics. Do they have the resources internally to feel supported? The second point, in terms of if you're joining a company, you're trying to get a gauge on how diverse is this company. Visually, maybe it doesn't look diverse. I think connect to the people team, ask them those questions. If you're being interviewed, don't be afraid to drop that into one of the questions in that interview. I'd like to, and if you're underrepresented, you might just say, look, I want to join an environment where I feel included. So it'd be good to know, what is your demographic split? Who do you have in senior leadership, for example? How well do you understand that? Some companies are really good with capturing that data. Some are most definitely not. So I think it's really good to not be afraid to ask questions as well.
All right. Okay, Catherine, first question be from you.
Thank you. Yes, really interesting, well presented. Thank you, Frank. I just wanted to ask, I've tried to raise issues in the past in companies, and I have found that people are so terrified of being labeled as being biased that they become very defensive, because the consequences, if that were to be the perception of somebody at an organization, are quite serious for that individual. So I just wondered how you can raise something, if you were recruiting in a group, how do you raise those issues without making people feel, well, unless you really do feel that they are definitely openly being biased, or it's unconscious bias? How do you raise those issues without making people feel you're attacking them?
Yeah, I think there's two things you can do. I think firstly, if you're challenging an actual person, I mentioned that calling someone in. I think in a practical way, you could challenge their actions or challenge their words. So actually, as opposed to kind of calling them out at all, or even just referencing them as a person, it's like actually the words you've just used, I think, might be biased towards certain underrepresented groups, or that if we made that decision, conscious that it may exclude certain groups. So just want to double back on that, because I think that is it's the friendliest way that you can challenge, but ultimately there's an element of egos here, isn't it? People need to be able to detox their egos and accept that challenge. And of course, that is the difficult part. Not everyone is willing to do that. I think the second thing we can do is spin it on a positive as well. Is this accessible? Is this inclusive? Does this decision support everyone, as the broadest sense of diversity as possible? Let's just check in on that. Do you mind if we discuss that a little bit further? Because that way, I think you're not focusing on the bias itself, you're focusing on the necessity to be an ally, right, and to support underrepresented groups. And then that kind of takes away the sting of the stigma, for want of a better phrase.
Thank you. Very
All
useful.
right.
Thank you.
Jin, over to you.
Hi. It's not triggering, but definitely I'm like here for all of what you're talking about. So I guess just to dive into my brand, I'm doing a diverse and inclusive swimwear brand for women. And one of the things I'm noticing, even in just like one-liner pitches or questions that I approach with guests from this course, is that they'll say, I'm not really the right person, so I can't really help you, ... And I'm anticipating a point where I may pitch with people and they're probably not really tuned into or aligning with the causes of my brand, being diverse, being inclusive, not necessarily being for women. And that's another topic that I want to kind of touch with you, but it's definitely going to be one of our core principles. So how can we address it Or do we just need to pick and choose the kind of people that we're pitching to and make sure that our values align?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, Jen. I think ultimately, what I found of just growing a company, that kind of represents diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that I have to ensure that the values, so being clear on my values and how I interact with organizations, even down to the partners that we take on board, is really, really important. Sometimes companies approach my Variety Pack and say, great, we want to deliver kind of these workshops, and I may ask questions as to why, or I may ask what the follow-up is, etc., and so on. If I don't get the answers I'm looking for, then it's quite tricky for me to say, okay, actually, I want to go ahead with this partnership. So I think it's just important to be clear on whatever your values are as an organization. Understand that you're creating a product that is ultimately its truth is the truth. It's your truth, and that is going to have a market in itself. So I think it's a good book to read, in fact, is Company of One by Paul Jarvis, where he talks about actually growing a company which is right for you, as opposed to feeling like you've got to scale to a certain level. And I think it's a really great thing when we talk about products or services which do just very closely align to whatever your values might be, which may just be more niche than other options out there.
Thank you. So the other question I had, which I touched on, was the product is mainly for women, but anyone else that identifies and wants that product, it's fine, they can have it. I'm not kind of limiting that to them, but I don't know how to address that. And I wonder if you've got any insight on how to address that.
Yeah, I think it's important to reference and recognize those that those where their gender identity may not match their sex at birth, for example. I think that's crucially important, because we don't want to create products which are excluding communities by design. It can be quite challenging, for example, if we're making our products accessible for those that have some kind of physical disability. Would it match all the criteria? Probably not. It can do, or maybe that's something you level up to in the future. But I think in terms of gender identity, I think it's important to recognize those that will identify as non-binary, those that identify as genderqueer, those that have transitioned their gender. How would this work for them? What's your narrative around that? Even down to being clear on sizes and fit and things like that. Obviously, that's all of those explainers are going to make everything more inclusive. But just down to the copy and the images that you use, when you've got an About Us page, are there pronouns next to each person's names? Like, all of these things will, again, it's going to make your product more inclusive, but do it obviously in a genuine and sincere way. Ensure that people working in your team actually understand the complexity behind that.
Thank you. The final question I have is, do you do things like podcast chats?
Do I personally? From time to time, I do. Yeah, I've got a few out there right now that I've recorded. I think I don't have a consistent podcast that I record, but I've got a few that I've been on recently in the last year. So
amazing. It would be great to reach out to you separately about that. But thank you so much. Very invaluable, and I'll leave it to the rest of the gang.
Thanks.
Okay, next question is from Mindy.
Hello, Frank. Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us. I guess my question is a bit more, once you have recruited a more diverse set of colleagues, what are some of the kind of common ways in which you've observed a kind of unconscious lack of inclusion in work processes? So, for example, I know that I've been recruited to improve diversity. So I've arrived, I look different, I sound different, but I'm expected to act exactly the same way. And I think that's, in a way, a much more difficult thing to overcome, to kind of move to a truly inclusive work culture and set of processes. So I kind of wondered what you had observed about that.
Yeah, you heard that expression, melting pot, right? Melting pot of cultures. What that actually originates from is the idea that underrepresented people would join a new environment, let's say, and melt away aspects of their culture that just don't match, that don't align with whatever their dominant culture might be. And I think many organizations operate in exactly the same way. They hire someone who might be underrepresented, and it's like, you've got to fit in, you've got to carve away all the aspects of who you are. So I think the first thing to really consider is the environment safe for people to bring as much of themselves to work as they feel comfortable? Or do people have to mask or cover aspects of their personality? That's across anything from dress code, having tattoos, being clear about your gender identity, the way you speak, like all of these things. Is it a safe environment for people to come in? Or is there an expectation that actually, why are you wearing that? Why is your hair like that? That person's speaking very differently. So I think those are the things we just need to consider in terms of how inclusive that environment is. Does it allow people to have that sense of belonging? The second thing we need to factor in, which I'll try and, I guess, answer very briefly, is diversity inclusion is often a kind of a positive approach to, let's become more diverse, let's become more inclusive. Equity, which is really about fairness, is ultimately about reducing harm in the workplace, harm through bias or harm through, certain behaviors. So why that is important is we've got to consider the things that create an environment of what I would call psychological danger, where people are not feeling safe to be themselves or to speak their truths or to challenge, right? And often that can be driven by things like micro behaviors, so just unprofessional behavior in the workplace, which just happens in such a subtle way you don't necessarily catch it, but that can create a kind of a negative environment. We've all been there. Microaggressions, those intentional or unintentional slight snubs, moments of disrespect, how often do they happen in your workplace? Is it very common that people are coming to work and they're being microaggressed, being questioned about their identity, being questioned about their skills, performance, etc., and so on? All of these things, they do cause harm. The cumulative effect, people are coming to work with low self-esteem, can even trigger, all sorts of mental health challenges. So inclusive climate, encompasses these two things. How do people have a sense of belonging? What's our criteria in terms of allowing people to be themselves? And then how are we reducing harm by focusing on fairness, by challenging bias, by ensuring that an environment doesn't feel in any way, people not feeling that sense of unsafety, danger, sorry, is the word. And I think these, there's a lot more to focus on, but I think definitely starting there is a good place to look at.
Wonderful. Okay, Noella.
Thank you. I love listening to you, Frank. I have worked a little bit in the space of D&I myself, and I still think I have tons to learn and check myself in. As a underrepresented person and diverse kind of member of the community here in the UK, I almost feel like, and I'm very early stage and still kind of growing the first part of the team, but I feel like every single process in which I get to choose teams or team members or even agencies to work for, etc., I do the opposite. I do kind of what I like to call it, and I might be wrong, that's why I'm asking, positive bias. So I'm almost kind of giving preference to those that I know everywhere else will be less prioritized. I kind of see myself choosing on purpose the female, the Black person, or the immigrant, or the person, because those are my experiences, and I know like it favors like my own experiences and how I felt the world and see the world. Is there a danger on that side, or do you think it's still so much space to grow that way that it is okay to have the positive bias?
So I think affirmative action is a good thing in terms of the next person I hire, I want to be from an underrepresented group. I think that's a really good thing, and that's a positive thing to look at. What we need to challenge, though, is within that mindset, there will still be biases, right? So we are still going to have a preference in terms of who that underrepresented person looks like. And that preference, this is not specific to you, this is for all of us, that preference could be based on how this person communicates, actually are more, this person, one person's neurodiverse, the other one isn't, the other one's neurotypical. So actually, I don't know enough about them. So this person, in terms of, they've told me they're neurodiverse, I do want to hire them, but I'm not sure if they'll fit in. The same may apply for this person has a disability. They've made that clear to me. I'm not sure if we'll be able to be fully accessible. We've just paid, £2,000 for this tool that we're going to use. Will they be able to use it? So I think all of these things we need to just consider in terms of, it's important to promote affirmative action in the workplace, but let's ensure we're just doing it inclusively. We're not taking away from that sense of fairness in that process, because someone often gets almost kind of is still kind of excluded in some way by us not just being consecutively fair in that process. So I think being consistent is just truly important, and just recognize that there are more underrepresented groups than often what we think of, right? There's such a wide remit, so that the more we can focus on that wider net, the better.
Thank you so much for that. That's such a great point. And I think it's spot on, because as a solo founder, for example, if I had to face like a candidate who I think could be good, but I have to learn tones to understand their needs, I might naturally just not prioritize them, because I feel like it's going to take away a lot from my bandwidth and efforts, energy, etc. So do you know of any resources that could help small teams kind of understand when to start prioritizing these, and also kind of how to make it more accessible for them?
Yeah, I think that one of the best ways is to connect to communities that advocate for underrepresented groups. So like the BYP, for example, the Black Young, have got obviously host events all the time. So I think all of these, the different communities that are out there, like following Pink News, for example, they're talking about all the challenges that LGBTQIA colleagues might face in the workplace. This just generally helps us to not have a kind of a band-aid approach to doing this. We start to just think on a higher level of how do we challenge our bias and be more inclusive. And of course, there are some kind of tools out there as well. If you log onto our website, I think there's some literature on that too. But I think more so think about the long game of actually how do we ensure that we're just fair, and let's create job descriptions where we're trying to encourage people who are underrepresented, but we're using a framework to move to challenge those gut decisions. So.
Thank you so much.
All right, Emile, over to you.
Hi, so I had a quick question about tapping into the talent that we don't always get exposed to. So for instance, I've recently joined a neurodiverse founders group on WhatsApp. And if I wanted to hire an individual, but want to have kind of a wider reach, because as you mentioned, people aren't always given access to certain opportunities, or may not feel qualified to apply despite being a perfect fit. So there are websites or groups that are available where you could post those job listings, kind of just get that to a wider audience.
Yeah, was that a question? Was that were you mentioning there are? Yeah, absolutely. There are quite a few. I mean, there are several communities on LinkedIn that you could, if you type in a particular underrepresented group, there are lots of communities on LinkedIn, on Facebook as well. There are several, there are lots of different communities that stand for different underrepresented groups. Generally, in your job descriptions, I think it's important to include a statement, if you don't match every single criteria in this description, we still want to hear from you. And in particular, we want to promote underrepresented candidates to come forward. We recognize that, we recognize the existence of that access gap. Whatever the case may be, you're just making it very clear that, to your point, not some people don't realize that they are the right candidate and therefore don't put their name forward. And we just want to create a safer space as possible.
Right, thank you. No, my question was definitely, are there kind of these platforms, very specific platforms for that sort of, for those sorts of job listings and the rest of it? So that's great, thank you.
There are particular communities, I would say, depending on the category of underrepresentation you're looking for. So BYP, for example, like-minded females, you know, they've got a huge community that advocate for women. If you're looking for other underrepresented groups, then I would say, yeah, there are quite a few. Probably just depends on which aspect of underrepresentation you're looking for. I'd say if it's people that are neurodiverse, I think what's beneficial is to firstly put a post on LinkedIn talking about it and connect to the community authentically that way. And I couldn't tell you the name of all the groups on LinkedIn, but there are quite a few different groups where people who identify as neurodiverse also talk about, you know, career challenges, etc., and are also looking for further job opportunities. So
Fantastic, thank you.
I have a quick question and then jump to Evelina. One situation that Purdy and I have had a couple of times is we have such a strong focus in like diverse representation in all of our speaker panels because we do a lot of events. And I'm pretty proud of the diversity that we have at all our events, both in terms of speakers and attendees. But we've had a few situations where we'll have a very diverse panel and then, you know, someone can't make it and then they have their colleague who is a white male and might not, you know, exactly be a diverse person on the panel, but they're very well qualified to speak. And we're thrilled to have them. But we also know that from the attendee perspective, it looks like we've, you know, put no thought or no effort into having diverse speakers. And we've also had a few times where it will be a pitch night or a demo day, and it will be a team of, you know, a woman and a man co-founders, and then the male co-founder is the one pitching and the woman doesn't, or she's a technical co-founder and will come on for the Q&As afterwards. But how do you manage that? I don't want to devalue the person who's speaking, because we're happy to have them there, but also want to send the right message to our attendees.
Yeah, I think the first point is people are really just looking for representation and consistency of message. So I think it's going to be hard, you know, especially when you're hosting, you know, several events, to always get that kind of right balance of, you know, a kind of a great slate of diverse speakers. But ultimately, consistency, I would say, is more important. I think there are some communities or organizations that every single event they put out there just completely lacks diversity. And I think ultimately, if there is a narrative of this is important to us, representation is important to us, or even visibility on that process of, you know, how we actually seek out speakers and what our process is and what can sometimes happen, I think that is a really great thing to be transparent on. I think the second point in terms of who comes forward and who gets a chance to pitch and who actually pitches in the end, I think sometimes it can be beneficial to have guidelines in place to ensure that actually we want to ensure that underrepresented candidates are also being exposed. So that could be the fact that actually, you know, 50% of people that pitch, you know, the lead person's got to be from an underrepresented group, and this is what we define as underrepresented. That I would look at as affirmative action in that space. Even though, of course, as you say, you know, we're trying to give everyone an opportunity, we're also trying to recognize, because it isn't a level playing field, even if the co-person is the person that isn't the person that's kind of lead on that pitch, can we invite more people who actually the person that is the lead is the underrepresented person, and then they get the opportunity? That can be a challenge in itself, but I think that's a great way to promote it.
All right, thanks for that. Evelina, your turn.
Hi, sorry, just couldn't unmute myself for a moment. Thank you, Frank. It was really, really insightful. And I wanted to pick a little bit more on, I work as a management consultant as well. And sometimes I see that companies are kind of going through this kind of tick box exercise, right? Where they need to have a specific, you know, skin color and characteristics to kind of meet some of their minimum gender kind of diversity and kind of gender equality requirements and so on. But they don't necessarily kind of do this in a right way. It becomes a kind of tick box exercise without really including that person that I'm sure this been mentioned before. So wouldn't be a better way of looking at diversity through kind of diversity of thought, diversity of kind of our values, our beliefs, our approaches through kind of the way we see the world differently, right? And especially, for example, as a startup co-founders, you're looking for co-founders and for team members to actually cover your weaknesses, to be as different to you as possible. And obviously in that you are creating, you're looking beyond, somebody's just, skin color or religion or gender and so on. You are really looking at diversity from those angles, and then you are really valuing that person for who they truly is, regardless of these kind of superficial characteristics. So how do you balance the two? How do you kind of still meet, make sure that you are including some of those underrepresented groups, but also going beyond that, right? So we're not just looking for that and a tick box exercise, but really looking through kind of real diversity and inclusion from that psychological sense of safety and variety of talent, because that's the way how companies will benefit at the end of the day, right? From innovation point of view, you want to make sure that you're having as many diverse thoughts and skills and values and approaches as possible. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think diversity of thought is really an outcome of increasing representation. I guess why I mentioned that is, in the first instance, we've got to look at the problem with representation. The reason why organizations aren't very diverse is because in the first instance, it's because we have systemic issues with prejudice that is built into policies, procedures, society, right? So racism, sexism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, the list goes on. All of that creates an issue in terms of actually people genuinely have barriers to get into certain positions. So I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is when we're increasing representation of underrepresented groups, here, these are the people that are underrepresented, these are the reasons why. Diversity of thought is an outcome to that. Why that's important is we're not ignoring the impact of these systemic issues. And why, in the workplace, we often, I think there are many, for example, exec leaders that would say, great, we are going to, we've got two spaces on our board, and the most important thing for us is diversity of thought. That could be an excuse at times, at that level, that could be an excuse to, great, I'm going to hire people who I identify with in terms of race and gender. But diversity of thought is, one person has this particular background, and we got them to this place, and they are not, they don't come from an Oxford and Cambridge University background, but it's slightly different. And another person may be diversity from a socioeconomic perspective, so that's not a bad thing. But as long as we're not using it as an excuse or a reason to ignore a lot of the systemic issues, then I think it's a really positive thing. But we just need to recognize that in the first instance, people are underrepresented for a reason. So when we increase representation, diversity of thought is just an outcome of that process.
Yeah, that's great. That's a very, very useful way of looking at it. And especially, I think, very often within diversity and inclusion, it's presented as some of those, processes, policies, and procedures are there to benefit the individual that is being included, right? But actually, I think we need to start thinking other way around, and we need to really look at, this is also for the benefit of the organization, because it will then result in that diversity of thought and higher levels of innovation and productivity, and kind of covering all of the blind spots that otherwise company wouldn't be able to do. So I think it's very, very important to kind of not to present this as just a charitable initiative only for that individual. It's actually, no, by excluding that individual, you are losing out as a company, as a team, as a culture. So yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Wonderful. We're at time. By the way, Frank, Ali had to leave early, but she said this session was the best start to a Monday ever. Love this conversation. And she said, thanks, Frank. Which echoes what I have to say. So thank you so much for your time this morning. It was so informative, and you have like an incredible ability to articulate really difficult topics of discussion. So thank you for your time. And is the best way for people to connect with you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, just Frank Starling on LinkedIn. My email address is frank@varietypack.co. You can check out our website.